The series 5 Days at Memorial took a giant event of Hurricane Katrina and the flooding of New Orleans and personalized it. You really felt the tragedy of what it was like to be in a hospital surrounded by forces and no way out. I'm Eric Durst, Visual Effects Supervisor of 5 Days at Memorial, and we use visual effects to help tell the story of Hurricane Katrina and the flooding of New Orleans. The project itself was daunting in a sense. You've got the whole city that's underwater, and you have to portray that. We had a tremendous amount of footage that we had, but the one thing that was never really photographed, there is no visual reference of this or no visual documentation of this, is the moment where some of the most iconic moments in the entire tragedy happened. For instance, the Superdome without the roof. Everyone looks at an image of that and everyone immediately goes to the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. It's just an iconic moment. One of the big things that we had to do in visual effects was to accurately portray what had happened, and we had to do it forensically. And so we did a tremendous amount of study of that. And one of the interesting things was understanding how levees breach. I always thought that the water that was going over the barrier, the levee itself, the levee like cracked or exploded or something like that, and I didn't understand how it could cause such damage. But what it is if you can imagine, this is the levee here. It's made in terms of panels. There are these sections, so they're like 8 to 10 feet wide, and the water goes up to the side of it, and it gets very, very high, and there's a giant surge that's happening and pounding on these walls themselves, and the water starts to go over the other side, and it goes into the foundation of the levee wall itself. And so once it gets into the foundation, if the foundation isn't solid, it just immediately flops down. And as it flops down, it unleashes a tremendous amount of water, a wave that is anywhere from 12 to 20 feet. It's like a giant tsunami. And this tsunami just went in and just completely wiped out the lower Ninth Ward and the houses that were closely held next to each other, and it was like a bomb went off. And so we had to portray that in a way that was realistic, and we wanted to be as accurate as possible. It's hard enough just to photograph it if it was there, but actually to create it if it isn't there is requires a lot of tools and a lot of technology to do. So we knew we had to be very strategic about how to do that. And Carlton Cuse and John Ridley, who were the writers and showrunners of this, directors of this, they really wanted to work with everybody and figure out how this comes together. We did a lot of this in pre-visualization. And a couple of months before we started shooting, we were still under COVID protocols, so we were all Zooming with each other. And actually that was a benefit in this case because we were able to all see the same screen at the same time, and in a way it sort of focused us. Matt Wheeland, who is the other VFX soup on the show, is just tremendous, actually brilliant at being able to visualize things. And so he is very good at 3D as well as drawing, so we could have conversations with all of us, and Matt could help us visualize that and make it actionable. And that was a huge asset that we had for this. So we built the hospital sets and the helipad and all the main locations that we needed. We did that in the computer. We put those in Unreal Engine, which allowed us to move around in real time very quickly. So when we came to a Zoom session, we had several of these during the week for many hours, ourselves as well, and Carlton Cuse and John Ridley, Danny McNair, the VFX producer, Matt and myself, and Ramsey Nickel, who is the DP on the project. All of us would meet and go into this virtual space. It was like being on the set itself, but it was in the computer. So we were able to move around And it was very fluid. It felt like we were really there. And we got to make choices about camera angles and where blocking would be, who would be where, and really get into very, very specific shots itself through this process. It was so fluid, and it really helped everyone wrap our heads around what was to come in the months that follow. And so when we got to the actual set, we all felt like we'd been there before. And it was remarkable when you go to this giant set, and the set was in this giant tank. We had this 280 by 130 foot, 1 million gallon water tank, of which a part of the set, the ER ramp, was there, just part of it, and then in visual effects we built the rest of the hospital. But that allowed us to feel like we'd been there. So one thing that happens when you previs sequences is that once you get to the location, everything is sort of different and angles change and your whole initial plan falls apart. But in this case, it was extremely accurate. We took great measure to have everything exactly the way it was. So when we got there, everything followed the plan that we had. We had to find houses that we could use during these shots, especially the destruction of the lower Ninth Ward. And so went through all the neighborhoods around and identified 27 houses in that process, and then hired Crafty Apes, who's a visual effects company down in Baton Rouge, very close to New Orleans, and hired them to go to these houses and LiDAR scan. The LiDAR is a laser device that can measure, that shoots out a laser, and you can measure space that way, and also use drones, and drones could go around the houses themselves, and by that you could build a three-dimensional model of the house. So we had these 27 houses that we created, and with those there was enough variation we could duplicate them and make the whole city out in front of us with those individual pieces, and that would give us the city itself. The story 5 Days in Memorial is based on a book called 5 Days in Memorial, which started as a New York Times article. It was written by Sherry Fink, who is a tremendous investigative reporter. She won the Pulitzer Prize for her work. During Hurricane Katrina, everyone was latched down to think it was the worst hurricane of all time. And so when it happened, everyone was bracing for the worst. The hurricane diverted a little bit. It wasn't as bad as people thought. And the next day it was beautiful. The sun was out. Everyone was high-fiving each other. It was just, everyone had such great relief. But unknown to them, in the levees surrounding New Orleans itself, the water had started to surge, and eventually the levees broke, and water was coming towards the hospital. They didn't know at the time, because there was so little communication, what was about to happen. So eventually the water came in, it flooded the hospital itself, and it took out all the power. And you can imagine, if you're in a hospital, you have hundreds of patients. There's no power. It's 115 degrees inside the hospital itself, and ventilators that are on generators, which are on batteries, which are draining all the time, and you have very limited water. So it was a terrible situation. Compounded with that is that they had no evacuation plan at all for flooding. So they had no relationships with helicopters, with the National Guard to come rescue them, nothing to do, no relationships with boats that could come and save them. They were on their own. And when they would call the government to get relief and find out if they could get help, they were told that they were on a non-priority list and they were just on their own. It was a helpless situation. And there were two areas that they could hopefully get people out. One was the ER ramp, and a lot of the staging for the show is in the ER ramp around that area. That's where boats could come in. And up on the top in the helipad. And hopefully finding helicopters could come and rescue them. But they didn't know if the helipad would actually hold the helicopters. It hadn't been used for 30 years. Even though they had had many attempts at revitalizing the structure, it never happened. They also didn't have power, and because they didn't have power, there were no elevators that went up. A team went up to check it out and see if they thought it could hold. They saw some helicopters come around. One came in, they waved them in, and they landed, but they were afraid that it might collapse, but the helicopter landed itself, and it was okay. The whole structure itself vibrated, so it was very flimsy, but it was able to support the helicopters. And so they ended up finding a few helicopters here and there, just flagging them down, and then they would have to bring the patients up one at a time on this rickety, very narrow staircase. Sometimes it took 20 to 40 minutes to bring one patient up, and you can imagine you have a hospital of hundreds of patients that need help, and a lot of them are just in extensive critical care, and they either can't be moved or just they have a very hard time getting them up and rescued. It was a tremendously tragic event, and everyone was stressed to the limit. Eventually, they had some boats that came and they got some people out. They eventually got some helicopters and started getting people out. After 5 days, the government came and said, you have to evacuate. Everyone has to leave. And they were ready to evacuate, but they couldn't get all the patients out. If you can imagine a patient that's 400 pounds that they cannot lift and bring up to those rickety stairs, or someone else who has other debilitating problems that they couldn't move. After the evacuation, the government came in, some investigators came in a boat and went to the hospital, went inside, and they went to a chapel, and they saw these bodies, or these forms in front of them, and there were bodies with cloth around them. And after the investigation, they discovered that 35 of them had been euthanized. That is the central point of the story, is what would you do? If you have a patient that you can't take care of, are you going to leave them on 115-degree weather, heat, without any way of surviving that way? Just let them rot? Or you transition them, for lack of a better word. And that is the story of 5 Days of Memorial. It's a tremendously powerful series, and it's on Apple TV, and it's just a very impactful story to watch.